But before I begin my remarks, I'd like to thank certain people. First, I'd like to thank the ambassadors for having to taken the effort to put together this event, led by Teresa, the neighbors. They've done a spectacular job, as they always do. Next, I'd like to thank Professor Precipio and Professor Petrarca. Both of them have major administrative responsibilities in the university, alongside of their current teaching responsibilities and research responsibilities. And their willingness to take their time to participate in this evening's debate is a tribute of their commitment to what is essential to the university, a setting where there is discussion and debate. And finally, I want to thank you for coming. And when I want to say thank you, I'm thinking especially of the bulk of the audience, which is composed of UCI students. All of you have plenty of do to keep busy. You have homework, you have drugs, you have alcohol. You have potential sexual conflict. You have difficulty, you have pain, and yet you've come here tonight to listen to and to talk about a big issue. That's nice. That makes me feel good. I'm delighted to participate in the event, and I thank you for coming. I also thank those of you who do not appear to be undergraduate students, although maybe you just work harder than the rest, for being interested in joining us to argue about a topic. Now we get to the issue at hand. The resolution that we are debating is not about whether the Trump campaign undermines our democracy. It is not about whether our democracy can survive a Democrat running for president. The issue is whether the Trump campaign should be viewed by those most committed to democracy and the democratic process as beneficial. That is to say, as helping to improve our system. And the answer to that question is a resounding no. Democracy, above all else, is a system in which candidates compete for political power, and the citizenry decides who's going to win. In turn, the losers and those who support them must accept their defeat, support the system which gave rise to their defeat, and wait for the next election. If you don't think that's about democracy, what democracy is about, look at the Arab Spring in Egypt and what happened there, and you can see what democracy is not about. For such a system to endure, for the adversaries, for the losers to stick with the system, adversaries must be opponents, not enemies. Issue positions must be clearly stated so that the voters are not choosing simply personalities, but more importantly, endorsing distinct policy positions. Political opponents must be treated as worthy, even if they're seen as wrong, misguided, and ignorant, they're still worthy. Tolerance is a central value required for the democratic process to work. Now, in this context, the Trump campaign is bad for democracy. It is pernicious, not only because of Trump's behavior, and by that I'm referring to his personal attacks, his group attacks, and his self-adulation, but also because of the responses his campaign elicits from the citizenry. He plays to people's worst instincts, not to their best instincts. Let me go through first personal attacks, group attacks, and self-adulation. His characteristics, personal attacks. He tends to attack the person rather than that person's policy and action. Such attacks should have no place in the democratic debate. But for Donald Trump, these are central in his face-to-face with fellow Republicans. On Rand Paul, very difficult to decide which is the first.
No personal attacks.
No personal attacks. Did anyone ask for your opinion loud enough? You'll get your time. On Rand Paul, quote, I never attacked him on his looks. And believe me, there's plenty of subject matter right there. On Carly Fiorina, she can't run any of my companies, that I can tell you. And on Jeb Bush, a compliment. More energy tonight, I like that. Group attacks. Trump's constant generalizations about groups of people have no place in the democratic process. They simply appeal to prejudice and stereotype. The most notable one, of course, is the following, quote, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending the best. They're not sending you, they're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they're telling us what we're getting. Not surprisingly, Mr. Trump often combines personal and group attack on Ben Carson and his religion. Trump says, I'm Presbyterian. Boy, that's down the middle of the road, folks. In all fairness. I mean, a Seventh-day Adventist? I don't know. I don't know about that. And let's not forget that after Megyn Kelly's tough questions on Fox News about his attitudes towards women, he said she had, quote, blood coming out of her wherever. What about self-adulation? Short on specific policy proposals, Trump constantly tells his audience that he is Superman and can resolve all problems. Just trust him. I will build a great wall. And nobody builds walls better than I do. Believe me, and I'll build them very inexpensively. It's a cheap great wall. I will build a great wall. China has a great wall, so ours will be a great wall. On our southern border, and I'll make the Mexicans pay for it. I will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. Didn't your mother teach you you're not supposed to brag? This is beyond bragging. And not surprisingly, some of the assertions about self are supposedly references to what other people have said about him. For example, in early September, he told MSNBC that after a speech the day before, quote, the CNN reporter said it was the single greatest political speech that she had ever heard. Probably that had ever been delivered. It made the Emancipation Proclamation look like crap. As which reporter, he said, I don't know her name, but she was wearing a beautiful red dress. CNN, when asked, indicated that neither of its correspondents at the Trump event wore red. Maybe he's colorblind. Now, these characteristics, in and of themselves, I think, are unacceptable. But what about the responses his campaign elicits from the citizenry, from us, from people like us, from ordinary Americans? First, of course, one of the big problems is rhetoric of denigration of both individuals and groups brings out the worst in people. It's not that we don't necessarily have these things within us. We all have some degree of stereotypical thinking, no matter how hard we may try to suppress that. But when he speaks as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, he legitimates the rhetoric of denigration and hatred, which is a challenge to the very democratic process, not a lubricant of that process. That, to me, is an obvious objection. But there's perhaps less visibly, but equally importantly, a second problem. The underlying idea of the Trump candidacy and a major feature of his biography, which has garnered popular support, is his total lack of experience in governing the nation. Because of substantial dissatisfaction with the performance of Washington, a number of citizens have come to believe that putting someone in power with no experience in the government is a way of bringing about change. The idea is that the absence of entanglements with the existing system will permit changing that system. For simplicity's sake, we might refer to this, as a political scientist, as the Jesse Ventura model of politics, or since we're Californians, as the Arnold Schwarzenegger model. It does not work, and it's not surprising that it does not work. We can see this by considering a totally analogous notion. Imagine we have a basketball team that is not performing. The best way to improve the performance of our team is to recruit players who've never played basketball. Can you imagine saying that? You would either be locked up in an insane asylum or sent for an IQ test. Now, American democracy will survive Donald Trump, as it has survived other demagogues. But his campaign has hurt the democratic process by encouraging and legitimizing personal insult, group denigration, and fostering the silly idea that the absence of government experience is a valuable trait for a future government. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schoenfeld. Professor Petrarca, first rebuttal in the affirmative.
Thank you. Let me turn to the very last point before Professor Schoenfeld started to summarize, because the summary is just a repetition of basically the last 2 points that he made. The very last point is Trump lacks experience. First of all, as I thought I had made clear, we're not here to debate the merits of Donald Trump as president. We're here to debate the impact of his campaign on American democracy. I take no position on the question of whether or not Trump should or should not be president of the United States. However, I would point out for the record that we have had other presidents in the United States who did not have electoral experience prior to becoming president. We've had 4 generals, we had Herbert Hoover, we had Howard Taft, neither of whom are mainstays of famous, important American presidents, but Herbert Hoover was a superb cabinet official, saved Europe from starvation after World War I. He just turned out to be a really crappy president. We've never had, in fact, which makes the Trump campaign sui generis, a case unto itself, we've never had a high-powered businessman with the kind of popularity, and reality TV show host, let's not forget, with the kind of popularity that Trump has for really comparable purposes. There's certainly nothing in the Constitution which prohibits Trump from being elected president, although there might be something that would prevent somebody like a Ted Cruz from being president. We can talk about that later. Now, I want to make 2 opening observations before I turn to the top of Professor Schoenfeld's remarks. You all laughed at the recounting that Professor Schoenfeld engaged in of many of the things that Donald Trump has to say. Some of you laughed uncomfortably, some of you laughed fully. That's part of why Trump's campaign has been so healthy for this political process. As a political process, we have become entirely too full of ourselves. And we've hived off the running of this process to a bunch of people whose job it is to participate, not ours as citizens. Trump has engaged this country in a way that no other presidential candidate has engaged the country truly in my lifetime. The second thing is that Professor Schoenfeld's litany of things that democracy should be and the way that presidential candidates ought to behave is nice. But presidential politics in America has never been a Tea Party. It's never been a political system played under Wimbledon tennis rules. Presidential politics in America has, and in fact historically, was far rougher than anything that Trump has said to his fellow candidates. Not to borrow from the president's comments yesterday about the whining that's gone on over the last week from the indelicate questions that were asked at last week's CNBC debate. But let's face it, Obama's right. If these people can't stand that kind of heat from a couple of journalists, how are they going to really look nose to nose down Putin's face and get him to withdraw from Syria?
Consider the things that were said about Jefferson in 1800, or the things that were said about Grover Cleveland, for goodness sake. They had a song dedicated to his illegitimate child during the campaign. Seriously, right? I will defer to Professor Schoenfeld's recollection of campaigns that go back to the late 1920s. But prior to that, because my parents taught me to be respectful of my elders. But prior to the 1920s, American political campaigns for president were not pretty. They were not delicate. And they were played out, well, not played out on TV, they were played out with the elephants of journalism, namely the journals and the newspapers owned by the political parties, smashing away at each other in all of those elections. The things that Lincoln and others recalled just pales in comparison to what's been going on for the last couple of months during the Trump campaign. So Professor Schoenfeld really has created a kind of illusion of decorum about what campaigns should be about that has in truth never really existed. It may have existed a couple of times recently, but it's never existed. It's never been a quintessential feature of American politics. And I would argue that to the extent that in our lives we've seen more decorous campaigns, that's been part of the problem. One of the things that Trump has been prepared to do, because he can afford to do it, sort of literally and figuratively, is he's been prepared to speak truth to power. It makes people uncomfortable, lots of people uncomfortable, which is why people on the right are as eager to get him out of this race as people on the left are. And that's one of the reasons that he's contributing to the survival of this nation's democracy. Thank you.
Prior to the 1920s, the halcyon days of Trump-like politics, you will recall that blacks couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, Mexican immigrants couldn't vote, Asian immigrants couldn't vote, white males could vote. Those are the good old days when politics used to be the way Donald Trump would have it. I'm not sure that that's part and parcel of the greatest part of America's democratic tradition. So that's all I want to say about that. But I do think those things go together. One of the things that's happened is our society has become substantially more inclusive. And in that process, that has generated a need to be careful about how we talk about people who we don't like. And we all have people we don't like. We may tell our spouse or our children or our parents. We may hear a conversation or something and things that are said about people. Most of you know that's true. Well, one of the things that keeps our society civil is we don't raise those into the level of public discourse. Quite to the contrary, we avoid that, and that increases pushing us towards civility. Now, the crux of Professor Petrakis' core argument, weak as it was focused on the idea that during this period of time of the expansion of suffrage, democracy has suffered. That as America has become more and more incorporative of more and more diverse people, in turn, the democratic process works less well. Now, there's substantial argument that can be given to that position. For example, one of the things we all know that's funny about American democracy is the founding fathers wanted to make it tough to do things. The founding fathers were worried about a government that might make bold decisions too easily. That's why our system is so filled with checks and balances. I am certain that were Jefferson and Madison to be here, they wouldn't find it terrible that we have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. That's not the sort of thing to be avoided, as, for example, it is to be avoided in France, which has the belief that you need a government which can act quickly. constitutional system is predicated on the notion that it's tough to make decisions, and the idea is, therefore, when we actually get to make them, we'll really make better quality decisions. So I'm not at all convinced that the democratic system is broken, as Professor Petrarca has suggested. Now, he gave us 4 arguments as to why the Trump campaign was so good for democracy. First, it energized them. Well, his last was it energized them. There was a famous German political sociologist named Zimmel. And Zimmel made a distinction between fertile and sterile action. I think that one could argue that the energy produced by Trump is sterile, not fertile. It's not an energy to think more deeply. It's an energy to think, who the hell do we want to have around here? Frankly, me, I would prefer a university filled with elderly white males. I like those sorts of people. There are women all over the place. It's terrible. That's what Trump encourages. That's not the positive energy into the political system. It's a negative energy. Obviously, I don't prefer that. I'm sort of being a Trumpkin, as Professor Petrarca would have. Now, he also tells us that he's mocking the entire American political system. I'm not quite sure of that. I think that he is energetically, well, first of all, he is such an egomaniac. The idea of running was something that means I'm sort of have to stop. Was that, were you exercising your fingers or telling me my time was out? Okay, let me just say finally, to sum up on that thing, he may very well be mocking the system, but I'm not sure that's good for the system. Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll now open it up for questions. Let me remind you that the positions, as your program notes, the positions taken by the 2 professors during this presentation do not necessarily represent their own beliefs. I want to alternate between the 2.
One thing on it, in fact, the way we chose our side this time was the ambassadors flipped a quarter. We chose on the debate, and they flipped a quarter, and that's how it happened.
You see the result. So let's please identify who you're asking the question of, and the next person has to ask a question of the other presenter.
That's so that neither of us feel ego destroyed.
As you see, a
You're
low
so much more
risk.
sensitive about that.
We're both equally sensitive.
Professor Petrarca has come to one of these events armed.
Professor Schoenfeld, do you believe that the Trump campaign has literally harmed the system rather than...
Yes, I do believe the Trump campaign has harmed the system. And I believe, interestingly enough, it's harmed the system much more than the Carson campaign will be a parallel. Because what Trump has done is he has legitimized, because he is a candidate for the presidency, this kind of very personal attack on opponents and on groups. So, for example, if you say Hillary Clinton is dishonest because she has not revealed her emails, that's not a personal attack. That's based on a behavior. If you say, I haven't talked about Hillary Clinton's looks, you can imagine what I could say, that's a personal attack. That's Trump-like. And people don't do that. So they attack things that other candidates have done. They don't attack the person as Trump does. And secondly, the way he's attacked groups, particularly immigrants and Mexican Americans, is absolutely scurrilous. It's totally unacceptable. It's just unacceptable.
Don't you think that the voting is discern?
I believe that, sure, I don't think Trump, I think it's unlikely that Trump's going to become president. But I think that things like this, and that's the sense that I don't think it's good for democracy, there are lots of people sitting around their dining room tables talking about some group that they don't like. There are. You can look, I remember looking once, I couldn't believe it. I found somebody who made a list of hate websites. So I looked there, and you've got all these white citizen council and Ku Klux Klan, and they sell t-shirts. And I said to myself, who buys these things? Where are you going to wear them? You can't wear them going to Debbie's. And yet there are people buying these things. There are private places where people are allowed to say outrageous things, but not on the public stage. And that's what I find very dangerous about Trump, because since people do it in private, he's encouraging it to be done at the public level. And I think that's very, very dangerous. Myself.
Well, I just have to say one thing about this, because the Republican Party for years has used symbols and code to say exactly what Trump has the chutzpah, to use a good old-fashioned Yiddish phrase, to say out loud. Well, have we forgotten the Willie Horton commercial? Oh, Willie Horton was just a random person being released from jail by Michael Dukakis in the state of Massachusetts. I'm sure the Republican Party had no intention to suggest